everybody see a beautiful green background and with words on it. Okay, very good. Thank you very much. So today's talk, I want to thank very much the Voluntary Action History Society and the Institute of Historical Research, as well as the UWW Institute for Nonprofit Management Studies. So talking about the Gary Neighborhood House, and I will so spoiler alert, right now, I will tell you, it started in 1909. It ceased formal operations in 1971. And what you might ask, do we have to learn from, obviously a failed organization, right? It closed its doors. That only happens if you're not managing things correctly, right? Well, I am going to argue from taking a look at the decisions that they made across the board here, that this was an example of choosing mission over organizational longevity, which really runs counter to what we would expect, both from theory, and I'm certain that many of us have seen in practice as well, choices that are made to extend the organization, because if we don't extend the organization, what good are we doing? So the plan here, I want to start by situating the discussion. One of my favorite podcasts that I listen to has to do with the often early history of New York City. And I've learned this, let's situate the discussion from them. I think it's a very elegant way to start. This will include some definition, some context. We'll talk about the founding and the early history of the neighborhood house, just so we can see how it relates to broader context and also how they got where they were. And then the US Civil Rights era. I know that we have people joining from both sides of the Atlantic, and I appreciate that, and also the opportunities to learn from each other. I do work at a business school. I teach nonprofit management, and this means we're very fond of including things like theoretical frameworks that you can use to analyze situations. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about the importance of mission, and then identify what was really the key conflict that came up and the eventual resolution. So at this point, moving on, I wrote myself a little note here. Sting is to Englishmen in New York as I am to a Midwesterner in Canterbury. So basically, Sting and I are basically having, very much the same circumstances here. And then I wrote myself a little note. Too bad I can't tell if people are chuckling, rolling their eyes, or wondering who Sting is. So just in terms of settlement house movements, and I feel like probably the people who are joining this call are very likely to be familiar with the concept of settlement house movements. On the other hand, I find that when I speak to certainly my students, but even when I speak to my family, they have no idea what I'm talking about. Settlement houses, of course, are a phenomenon that occurred on both sides of the Atlantic. The earliest record I found was that of Toynbee Hall in East London, settled by Samuel and Henrietta Barnett. And of course, this was settled, he's a C of E a pastor, I believe. So it had that religious influence, with the idea being, we need to not just have a relationship of charity that is from one level to another. We need to actually live with people who are poor, and that is how we will understand the context of the challenges and be able to address them. So 1884 founds Toynbee Hall in East London. One of the people who had actually lived in Toynbee Hall for several months then moved to New York City and found what was the earliest example of a settlement house that I could find in the United States. Shortly after that, we have the founding of the most famous settlement house in the United States, Hull House in Chicago. founded by Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr. And I absolutely love this about Hull House. Not only does it have ties to helping people who are poor and in Chicago, an immigrant community, it also has ties to early sociology, the development of social science. And my very favorite part, it has ties to the development of community theater and the ideas that, art is something that everybody ought to be able to experience, which is a little tidbit that I just love. So in 1909, when the sisters Kate and Jane Williams decided to found Neighborhood House in Gary, they didn't live in Gary. Gary was less than 10 years old at that point. They lived further east. But this was something that was new to Gary, but it was not new. It was not a new idea. It was an established idea as a way to try to stabilize the social conditions in neighborhoods where there's not much wealth or much foundation. So we see here, this is the front page of the Gary Tribune, and you see the South Side Mission begins its work. I'm sorry, it's really quite a dreadful, I think it came from the microfiche at the Indianapolis Library, but the South Side Mission begins its work to be Gary's Hull House and very much tied in with the Presbyterian community. And if you look slightly to the left there, you'll see that they were also announcing the ascension of King George and Queen Mary on the same date. So obviously this was quite a news day in Gary. So it was founded to be what Gary needed. First, as a kindergarten by Kate and Jane Williams. They were the first human services provider in Gary. This picture came from their archives. It was taken in 1917, so about 8 years after it was founded. And if you look, this brick building, excuse me, which was not their first building, this brick building, and compare it to the buildings around there. Gary, when they founded it, it had been a planned community founded in 1906 around the new U.S. Steel plant that was there. And as a company town, they planned houses and a neighborhood for the management, but not for the people who would actually work there. And what you're looking at behind the building that is Neighborhood House is where everybody else is, right? No sewers, several bars apparently. And as they were there, they started as a kindergarten and expanded their services into things like religion as being founded in partnership with the Presbyterian Church, having classes in English and job skills, having a health clinic, and finally visiting nurse services. Now, if we look at the general arc of settlement houses in the United States, we see that they had a very strong influence up through World War I. So 1914 to 1918 was really kind of the peak of their influence. And one thing that is, I believe, distinct between the UK settlement houses and the US settlement houses is that ours tended to serve largely immigrant populations and largely non-English speaking immigrant populations. There was a lot from Eastern Europe, for example, at this period. But then a war changes things, as it tends to do. There were restrictions on immigration that came about as a part of World War I and immediately after. But at that point, we also had what in our history we call the Great Migration of African Americans from the South trying to escape the legacies of slavery and the Jim Crow racism that was really prevalent. And over a 60-year period, we had what we call the Great Migration of African Americans moving up from the South more towards the Midwest and other cities in the northern United States. And then as time went on, there's continued migration from the South, from Mexico, from the Caribbean. So you're seeing that the populations are changing, and settlement houses are no longer having to serve so much in terms of immigrant populations. We also see trends of the staff professionalizing. The people who are running these houses are less likely to be explicitly tied with the church clergy. They're less likely to be volunteers, you know, your upper middle class or your lower upper class volunteers. And instead you're getting in people who have like degrees in social work, right? And we also see that there's more of a shift away from residential programming to community programming. And in Gary, we actually see echoes of these same population patterns, right? So Gary was established in 1906, neighborhood house, 20 years after the establishment of Hull House, so an established technology, if you will, but really only 3 years into Gary's existence. And we see the same thing with waves of European immigrants. And then as the city grows, the racial makeup of the city changes, much as you see in several of the other cities that had settlement houses. All right, so now I want to take us into the civil rights era. In 1962, the annual report for the Gary Neighborhood House described the area immediately surrounding it as known for its high rate of crimes against persons, for prostitution, for dope and gambling. Housing is crowded. In most instances, it is deteriorating. Most units are rented with very few owner-occupied units. The population for the 24 square block area is 4185, and all, in the words of the time, they said Negro. We would say African Americans today, except for 69. And this had to do with racialized housing, with people outside this neighborhood refusing to rent to people who were not white. The average income is about 1,700 less than the average income throughout the city, and the majority are employed as unskilled labor. So in the early 1960s, Gary was the most racially segregated city in the US. This has bounced around. Chicago was shortly after that. Detroit is currently recognized as highly segregated. There are other cities, but this gives you an idea, and it largely has to do with these redlining ideas of this is where white people live and this is where people who are not white live, right? So in 1962, we see that there's the first open housing bill, meaning you can rent to or sell to, and you must, not make decisions on renting and selling based on race. It was defeated in 1962. 1964, it was defeated. In 1965, it was strongly opposed, but it passed. And I bring this up because I believe that you can't talk about the arc of the neighborhood house without talking about race. This was a rather appalling letter that I found in the archives that was sent from one of the councilmen of Gary opposing open housing, and quite nakedly just asking, it's not, the question here is whether the white people are going to take this sitting down, right? And I apologize, it looks like the margins got cut off there, but it's just to present eyes rather shocking, and apparently less shocking to the people who were reading it at the time. So into this, we get a new leader for Neighborhood House. We have Reverend William Brooks, who's a really interesting character. He's a community organizer. He was a World War II veteran, played trumpet and got involved with the chaplaincy in World War II, came back and got a job at the post office, started doing literacy workshops for people, and decided to attend attend the Gammon Theological Seminary, which was in Atlanta. And while he was there, he was labeled a communist and fired from the post office, largely having to do with his work teaching literacy, helping to work with the Works Progress Administration, which was set up to help pass labor legislation and workmen's compensation legislation and Social Security, consumer education. And this is unfortunately a trend that we see during this time period in the 50s and the early 60s, where basically anybody who was being more socially active was being labeled a communist to try and diminish their claims. And I saw transcripts of his trial that he kept and deposited in his archives. So clearly this made a real impact on him. While he was at the theological seminary, where he concentrated in community organization, he received a divinity degree and a master's in social work. He was a proponent of what came to be known as the social gospel. And so when he assumed the leadership of the Gary Neighborhood House, you see this high degree of professionalism coming and focusing on expansion of programs and of people and of the identity of the organization. Just a word on the social gospel. This was a movement that applied, it was particularly prevalent in Black churches, but not exclusively, but largely, and had to do with applying the teachings of Christianity to the political issues of the day. So basically saying, if people have an inherent dignity, then it is part of what God wants to advocate for that today and not just wait for, heaven, right? Part of his writings that I found said, the church must be a bulwark of basic human freedoms: the freedom to learn, the freedom to serve, the freedom of fellowship, the freedom from want, and the freedom from fear. So this really brings a sense of the philosophy that he is bringing to this organization, which again had these strong ties with the Presbyterian Church. So at this point, I want to take a moment to introduce the theoretical framework that I'm using here. And this is a very common framework when you're looking through like management of organizations. It's called resource dependence theory. And this is, I almost chuckle when I hear this as a theory because that makes it sound quite grand, but really as an idea, you might read it and say, oh, well, duh, right? So basically resource dependence theory just acknowledges that organizations exist within an environment. If they are going to survive, there are certain resources that they need to acquire and replenish for their survival. Therefore, they will make choices that support the acquisition and the maintenance of these resources. And obviously financial, but could also be human resources, could be expertise, could be sites, could be anything that you need to do what you do. So I want to take this and keep it in mind, just put in the back of your mind, as we start looking into the policy environment that they are in. So at the national level, we have going on here President Johnson's federal war on poverty. And we see people within Gary arguing that there are systematic failures within Gary, that Gary is showing a lack of responsibility to its citizens, that we are seeing that the organization does not have the capacity to fill the gap that Gary is leaving behind, right? We do see at the federal level the development of these economic opportunity centers, so it looks like there's some attention being paid here. Gary itself was named a model city. As part of this, they decided, and this was not just Gary that did this, to have a program of urban renewal, which essentially would be raising the buildings in economically depressed areas. And on the surface, that sounds like, okay, so you're getting rid of the slums. All right, I can see that. Yet I have also seen, for example, in Birmingham, Alabama, where they chose to raise was a thriving middle class Black neighborhood, right? So it could be used on the surface. It's yay, get rid of the slums, but how it's then applied is very important, isn't it? And it was being applied to this neighborhood in which Neighborhood House was. And then within Neighborhood House, we see them taking advantage of a federal program called Vista Volunteers, which essentially meant that the federal government would pay a salary, not more like a stipend, not so much a living wage, and help match up volunteers with organizations that could really use them. We also see, that social gospel that I was talking about. Neighborhood House, in its writings, in its annual reports, it starts aligning itself with this idea of being part of the prophetic church militant. Again, not meaning like actual armed weapons, but this idea of being very active and saying, if people have inherent dignity, we need to be active about that, right? So there's a lot of movement going on in this period. It's really quite a volatile situation. And even though Neighborhood House wasn't directly receiving federal funds, although they did benefit from this VISTA program, this is the environment that they're trying to navigate, right? And so let's take a look at the next resources, which I'm going to look at human resources here. And if you look at the red line, and this is over Reverend Brooks's tenure, you'll see that the number of board members goes up, and that starts to decline a bit. The number of staff members really rises quite a bit. So that suggests a wealth in the human resources. If you look at a little more closely, though, you can see that the paid staff, there's the full-time staff is the red line. There's the yellow line is the part-time staff. And then the blue line is volunteers. So you see that starting around 1968, those full-time staff members start to decline a little bit, and you see that being picked up with increasing part-time staff and increasing volunteers. So now let's look at the financial resources, and we want to look at these from the bottom up. So 1962, they had a budget of about $52,000. And I do want to say, when I was looking at these annual reports, I am not confident that they captured, for example, gifts in kind in here. There were a lot of things with a gift in kind being where somebody would donate services or donate goods rather than money, right? And I'm not confident that that was entirely captured in these. So just looking at the money, you can see that between 1962 to 1970, the income goes from $52,800 up to $94,721. And generally speaking, they typically spent everything. So even though the dollar amount is increasing here, the reliance on full-time staff is decreasing. And then finally, I want to take a look at the funding sources here. And the red line represents the United Fund. One of the trends that we see closely incorporated with settlement houses in the United States is that they tend to be supported by what used to be called a community trust, then was called the United Fund. Currently, in the States, that's called a United Way. And there's this stability there, but you also see that in this era, it would be the United Fund really constraining the purposes and the activities of these settlement houses as a condition of receiving this money. And you can see that over the course of this period, where Reverend Brooks was leading it, the United Fund they were always the top funder. But in terms of percentage of the budget, it did come down from about 80% to about 60%. The Presbyterian Synod rose slightly to about a quarter of their budget. And this is something I do want to call out, because currently, if we have any fundraisers on the call here, you may be looking at this and being quite concerned about the reliance on one or two large funding sources. And you would be right to do that. But I would also say that looking back at studies of similar organizations at this time period, it was not uncommon for there to be this kind of heavy, about 60% reliance on the United Fund. What we do see is that for most social service organizations who show this kind of an income portfolio, by 1980, the United Fund and United Way has become less of the budget, and instead we see a significant growth in government funding, which has been criticized by some as saying, well, that means that you're going to be much more conservative in what you choose to do. But on the other hand, they survived, right? So let's just take a moment to take stock here. The networks and the budgets have been expanding through 1970. The networks involved now was a city-wide group called the Metro Corps. We're seeing the staffing levels as far as full-time getting lower, but when you fold in the part-time and the volunteers, quite robust. There are these environmental challenges, the open housing, the racialized aspect of where people can live. Gary Neighborhood House was a big proponent for passing open housing legislation. And then we also have this urban renewal targeting their neighborhood, right? So on the one hand, yeah, these are some big challenges and they're weighing in. They are not pulling bunches here. But on the other hand, when you have something to fight for, to fight against, that can really galvanize people too, right? In terms of leadership, in 1970, Reverend Brooks does step down, and they also make a philosophical decision to change from doing for the people who are their clients more into doing with, okay? Which also would track in with what we were seeing in terms of volunteers. Now, in 1971, the organization closed. When I first took a look at these archives, there was just a note that said, closed due to, ran out of money. I'm looking at that, I'm like, this doesn't seem to quite make sense. So why? Why did that happen? Here's where I want to shift over and take a moment to talk a little bit about organizational mission. So mission is essentially the who are we? Why do we exist within an organization? And if you look at people who study company mission statements, they tell us that these mission statements often incorporate a noble purpose. For example, if it's a more altruistic type of mission statement, it will emphasize serving the others and increasing personal happiness overall, right? If you have more of a heroic mission statement, it will emphasize being effective, achieving and producing results. And from the rhetoric that we see of Neighborhood House at this point, I believe that they are choosing a heroism choice. We see them coming in and making statements that the chairman, Reverend Terry, who stepped in when Reverend Brooks stepped down, that that you can't fight a cancerous growth of racism and discrimination with band-aids. You need to have systemic change, that it's not fair to make things that are wrong palatable instead of seeking to right it. On the other hand, from the United Fund, you see a great deal of pressure towards the altruism. Let's just make things better. Reverend Terry would say, no band-aids. United Fund would say, you're alienating people. So you see the board members and the staff of Gary House putting a great deal of thought into what it means to be mission focused, why they exist, who they serve, and how they can best be what Gary needs. So there are a number of things that lead up to the closure of the organization. They lose their charismatic leader who steps over to be part of this citywide conglomerate, the Metro Core. They succeeded in promoting the desegregated housing. This is a big win. This really helps the people who are in their neighborhood. But it also means that the people who were financially stable could move out to nicer houses. And it means that the ones who are left in that neighborhood are maybe the ones who are, you know, your high demanders, the people who have complex needs. You start losing some of your volunteers too. There were some structural changes in the federal welfare policy at this point too. And finally, and I think this is a big one, the board decided to prioritize the needs of the community over donor preferences. But wait, I hear some of you thinking, how can you do that and be there for those donor needs? Here's where I think they got really quite clever. The social services aspect of what they were doing was something that the United Fund had no problem with. This is something that was not making anybody upset. If you want to do basic social services, things that make things a little better for people, that's something the United Fund is completely on board with. They decided to spin those off to Gary Neighborhood Services, which was a merger of some of the settlement houses in the area. And that was a merger that was essentially directed by the United Fund, saying, hey, we don't feel like we should make 4 separate grants to 4 separate organizations. So here's what you're going to do. You're going to merge and you're going to cut out the stuff that's making people antsy, right? Well, they decided that made sense for some of their services to go there because that way they could retain some stability of funding. But they had also been providing legal aid to people who were being arrested for racial profiling, people who were who were having their legal rights really infringed on because they didn't have this resource of legal aid. So they spun that off into a new program called Project Justice and Equity. And what they did there was they collaborated with the law school at Valparaiso University and said, here, you take this. This is aligned with your mission. And then finally, they had been very active with community organizing. One of the things that made Neighborhood House distinctive was that it was of the community. It was focusing, shifting its focus from doing for to doing with, and calling on the resources of the community, which might not be financial, but include a great deal of knowledge about the types of things that they were facing and potential networks that could help mitigate or resolve some of those issues. And so for this, they founded the Neighborhood Action Institute and spun that off separately. So what we really see here is different strategy styles. Instead of straightforward resource dependence, we need to do what our largest funder says because otherwise they will stop funding us. They kept that for part of what they were doing. For the part that went ahead with the merger, hey, we're going to work within the situation. We're going to be more conservative about how we approach things. We're going to be efficient and reliable and make things better. But for the parts that we're trying to change the big picture, that we're providing legal aid to people whose rights were not being observed, that we're doing the community organizing to identify issues and possible solutions and to facilitate the resources to make more structural change. They said, you know what, we can't do that within the constraints of working within this situation. We need to find new ways to do things and have dramatic breakthroughs and follow instead a strategy of how can I make this different. And this is why, even though we have an organization that, technically closed its doors, I think by doing so, they managed to have their missions survive. So this is the end of my presentation. I can see that there have been some questions, and I'm going to take a sip of water and turn it over to what y'all